would like Rachel to take the mic.
Thank you, and thank you very much for organising this press conference. I think it's very important on this day that women's rights and women's voices are not ignored. We're going to hear a lot of talk this evening from President Obama about security and benchmarks for judging improvements in security. One thing I'd suggest is that actually the enabling women's rights and protection of women's rights should actually be one of the most significant benchmarks for success or otherwise in Afghanistan. Partly because, as Masuda mentions, these commitments were mentioned very early on in the international engagement in Afghanistan.
Excuse me, can you pull the mic more closely?
Sure. But also because it tends to be women who suffer most from the insecurity we see, whether it's caused by the insurgency or from the culture of impunity and warlordism that riddles the rest of the country. So a couple of points on what we're looking at with the Obama strategy. As Masuda says, there's much more focus on civilian protection at the heart of this strategy, which obviously we welcome. And yet at the same time I'm concerned that maybe there will be shortcuts taken, more because of the pressures of congressional timetables than an appropriate strategy. For instance, there's increasingly the US military is turning on militias to shore up its attempt to build up the Afghan National Army and police. There's a very rapid push to try and build up the Afghan police force in particular and turn them into a kind of paramilitary force, which means basically that there's very little training for Afghan police in what the law is. And obviously if women's rights are going to be respected, they need police officers who can uphold the law. And for that they need to be taught the law. And at the moment in the training that we see of the security forces, that's falling off the agenda in this very rapid push to build up the Afghan National Security Forces. So those things concern me. We see a lot of talk at the moment about a lot of focus on governance and rule of law, which is great. I think after the shambolic election that we saw in August, obviously it's been brought to everyone's attention quite how serious the problems of impunity are. So while I welcome this new focus on governance, because clearly this has a huge impact on women's lives, if they live in areas that are, whether it's they're living in areas that are effectively in the control of the Taliban or in control of a local strongman or warlord. I'm not yet convinced how serious this is, because I think, again, there will be short-term deals done to maintain the power of various warlords in the country, who the US has always had a relationship with from the beginning. There were short-term deals done whereby it was said that the cost of alienating or sidelining these characters was going to be too big in stabilization terms. And I think we see the impact of that now in the lawlessness of the country. I'll give you an example, a sort of concrete example of what that means for women's lives. There was a woman in the north of Afghanistan who was gang raped by the men of one commander. And after a very long fight to get those men brought to justice, at huge risk of her family, because this is very much a taboo to talk about rapes in Afghanistan, some of the men were actually put in jail. But after serving just 2 years and an 11-year sentence, President Karzai freed them by decree last summer. And that's an indicator, I mean, of President Karzai taking more seriously, as it were, the political deals he's made with some of the strong factions, fundamentalist often factions in society, rather than Afghan women's rights. And it sends out a terrible message from the top about quite how seriously he's taking women's rights. So that kind of impunity matters and needs to be addressed. And needs to be addressed by this administration in a very systematic, long-term way, rather than just demanding a couple of people are removed from power. Another way we see the impunity and the failure to really train a proper police force, in particular, women's access to justice for a whole range of issues, whether it's violence against women, child and forced marriage. We see many of the misogynist, essentially, views of society reflected in the police and the judiciary, and there's been a very little focus so far on training the judiciary and training the police force so that they can protect the rights of civilians. So if you look at the women and girls who are in prison, for example, more than half of them are there for so-called moral crimes, such as running away from home, which isn't a crime under Afghan law, or in Sharia, or adultery. I mean, that's an indication, that's the kind of the moral crimes that we saw under the Taliban era. So there needs to be much more work done in those areas. We see progress. I don't want to say the picture is all bleak. We saw this year a law passed called the Elimination of Violence Against Women Law, which was a huge achievement for the women who drew up that law. Pawasha here on the platform was one of the people who was involved in bringing that piece of legislation forward. And that's a massive achievement. The challenge is now going to be seeing that this is enforced. This piece of legislation made rape a crime for the first time in Afghanistan. So that just happened this year. Finally, I don't want to talk too long, we're happy to take questions later. One of the other reasons why I think it's very important that women's voices are being raised and not being excluded from the debate about security is that part of the McChrystal and Obama strategy, and we'll hear perhaps something about this tonight, is a move towards reconciliation and reintegration with the Taliban. Now, this clearly has potentially really serious consequences for Afghan women and girls. And when I try to speak to diplomats or politicians or people in the military about what this will mean and what guarantees they can offer Afghan women and girls that their rights will not be compromised, these few hard-won gains will not start to be eroded, they shrug it off, to be honest, at the moment and say, well, we wouldn't do a deal with anyone who doesn't sign up to the Constitution, which is really not enough to guarantee women's rights will be protected. So I think it's really important that questions are asked by organisations such as these here on the platform, by journalists, by the media, about what this will actually mean for Afghan women and girls as we move into this era of some kind of political settlements with insurgent groups. And finally, my last point, I guess, is that we see the continued commitment of the US, but as has already been said, because of domestic uncertainty about what the US and other international engagement is actually about in Afghanistan, we see increasing scepticism and questions being asked. I would hope that we see a long-term sustainable commitment, including lots of development assistance, and development assistance that isn't just done through USAID contractors, but actually goes directly to organisations like this who work on the ground and have much more chance of success in doing the really difficult work of starting to shift attitudes. It's going to take a long time to really substantially change the lives of Afghan women and girls, and that needs long-term investment and it needs support for Afghan organisations who are working on the ground.